Okay. Hi, thank you for joining the Woodland Owner Webinar Series hosted by My St. Croix Woods, a program of the St. Croix River Association. My name is Nikki Hanger and I am the Forestry Program Coordinator. The My St. Croix Woods program is a partnership of multiple public and private organizations throughout the watershed whose goal is to provide landowners with the resources and tools to make the best decisions on their land. Before we begin the webinar, I would like to take a few minutes to talk about the Zoom software, although I'm sure you guys are all experts at this time. Please leave your camera off and remain on mute for the entire webinar. You can type your questions in the chat at the bottom of your screen. You should just click on the chat icon and it will pop up. We will answer questions after both presentations, but feel free to type them throughout the webinar. The webinar will be recorded and a link to the recording will be sent out in the next day or so. I also have a survey in the chat box. Please fill out the survey to help us determine future webinar topics and tell us how we are doing. Today's topic will be about how forests can help local bats. We have two great speakers today, one from Wisconsin and one from Minnesota, to give different perspectives on this topic. And before we begin, we have one more event coming up this week. We have an actual in-person event. It is a Woodland Owner Walk, and will be in Pine City, Minnesota, for those of you who want to join. Registration is required, though, so we can get a head count, and it's from 1 to 3 p.m. on this Saturday. Okay, our first speaker today will be Sarah Herrick, a conservation biologist and the forestry liaison for the Bureau of Natural Heritage Conservation. She facilitates communication between NHC, assists forestry staff and partners with rare species questions and NHC staff with forestry questions, and provides information and training about forestry-related endangered resources issues to a variety of audiences. She represents Wisconsin DNR on the Lake States Forest Management BAT HCP Steering Committee. Today, she'll be talking to you about beneficial forest management practices for Wisconsin bat species. And Sarah, you can go ahead and share your screen.
Thanks, Nikki. All right, just give me a minute here to get my screen shared.
Yeah, of course.
All right, is everyone, or Nikki, can you let me know, are you seeing my slide there?
Yes, I am seeing your slide.
Okay, thank you. As Nikki mentioned, I am Sarah Herrick, and I am the forestry liaison for the Bureau of Natural Heritage Conservation at Wisconsin DNR, and that is what we call our Endangered Resources Bureau in Wisconsin. And my job, like as mentioned, is to basically advise the Division of Forestry and our external partners on issues related to endangered resources and forest management. So today, my talk will be, I'll start off by talking a little bit about bats in general, their biology and life history. And then I'll talk a little bit about some general guidance about forest management practices that are beneficial to bats. And I'll close by describing a little bit about the Lake States Forest Management BAT HCP, which is being developed jointly by Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Michigan DNRs in response to the federal listing and potential future listings of bat species. All right, just a second here. All right, so bats. Bats are not rodents, as many people believe, but are actually members of their own order called Chiroptera, which literally means hand wing. And if you see a bat up close, if you ever get a chance to go to a bat mist netting or something, their wings are like little hands with skin stretched between their fingers. So they are their own taxonomic order. They're long-lived species, or bat species are long-lived and slow to reproduce. They typically have just one young per year at the most. They can live as long as 10 to 15 years. And in fact, just a few years ago, our bat team was out mist netting bats, and they netted a bat that was originally banded in 1983. So that bat was over 30 years old at the time that they recaught it. In Wisconsin, we have 8 species of bats. 4 of the bat species, little brown bats, big brown bats, northern long-eared bats, and tricolored bats, which are sometimes called eastern pipistrelles, are hibernating bats, meaning in fall, when their food goes away, when there's no more insects, they have to find a place to hibernate for the winter. We also have 4 species of migratory bat, and they leave Wisconsin in the winter and fly south to places where they can feed on insects all year round. So some more about the life history. So their life history is actually pretty interesting. In late summer, generally around late August or early September, bat species begin either moving to the area around their hibernacula if they're hibernating bats, or heading south. And this period of their life cycle is called swarming. They typically swarm at the entrance of caves or on their way to their migration. And this is when they mate for the year. So around late summer, they move to the area of hibernation, and they mate, and then they begin going into to the hibernacula, usually in October. So yeah, as I said, as it gets colder, then the food becomes scarce, and they go into true hibernation. And the hibernating bats in Wisconsin and in Minnesota will hibernate generally from late September, early October through April. So they really are hibernating for a very long time. And then they begin to emerge from hibernation in late spring. Generally, the females emerge earlier than the males because they are looking for appropriate roost sites to raise their young, which are called pups. And this time in their life cycle we call staging. So they they leave the hibernacula, and they're sort of around that area for a while, looking for roosts, and then they move out onto the summer landscape. On the summer landscape, bats are foraging, and some species form maternity colonies of a few bats or up to 1,000 bats, depending on the species. And I have this highlighted on the slide because this time, when they're in their summer grounds, which is basically any forested area in Wisconsin or Minnesota, is when bats are in your forests, and when there's the potential, the opportunity to manage for them. In late summer, as I mentioned, adult bats are already headed back to hibernation sites or south, but the juveniles do hang around for a little longer to learn a little bit more how to forage and to gain fat reserves for the winter. So, as I mentioned, in order to survive Wisconsin winters, bats need to either leave, or they need to find somewhere where they will not freeze. In Wisconsin, underground caves and mines provide suitable hibernation habitat for the state's cave bats. And these bats are true hibernators in that they enter a torpor for several weeks at a time, though they occasionally arouse to groom, mate, move locations in the cave or mine, get a drink of water. While in torpor, the bats basically shut everything down. Their heart rate drops to several beats per minute. Their breathing drops to several breaths per minute, and their body temperature approaches the ambient temperature. So even though bats routinely rouse over the course of the winter, each arousal is very costly, and it consumes up to 40 to 60 days worth of fat reserves, and they need to hibernate up to 8 months. So the more they wake up, the less likely it is that they will make it through the winter. In summer, safe roosts are critical for bats, especially reproductive females. This is where the bats give birth, and they leave their pups there while they forage because they're unable to fly. Generally, the months of June and July are the time when pups cannot fly. Suitable roost sites are actually thought to be more limiting than anything else for bat populations, including food. Suitable roost sites are usually warmer than ambient, so things that have southern or eastern exposure, and they're usually enclosed for protection from predators and the elements. And I say usually because there are always exceptions to these things. Heat is very important for bats because they are required to use less energy to stay warm. Warm roosts also help the females gestate quickly, and it helps pups mature quickly. All of this adds up to a pup that's born and flying earlier, giving it a better chance to learn to forage and become a successful bat. Our colonial species in Wisconsin are the cave bats, as I mentioned. big brown bat, the little brown bat, the northern long-eared bat, and the tricolored bat. Big brown and little browns are most often found in large colonies of hundreds or even thousands, and they are the bats that are more likely to roost in artificial structures, bat houses, barns, attics, outbuildings. They sometimes switch roosts, but it's not as common as the natural roosters, northern long-eared bat and tricolored bat. The big brown and little brown, they are occasionally found in trees, especially the males. Northern long-eareds and tricoloreds, they form smaller colonies, usually 2 to 40 bats, and they're found in tree foliage, under bark and in cavities. The tricolored, they generally prefer foliage of oaks and hickories in southern Wisconsin. Northern long-eared bats use hardwood trees across the state. These behaviors have been found in other parts of the country, so it's not out of the ordinary. Tree roosting bats typically roost every couple days. So the northern long-eareds and the tricolored, they're roosting in a tree for a couple days, then they're moving to another appropriate tree nearby. And we aren't sure how big the net roost trees is or how many are required, since usually when we net and track bats, our trackers only last 1 to 2 weeks. Sometimes these two species will roost in artificial structures, but it's actually not that common. Bats, as many of you probably know, are voracious insectivores, and they can consume up to their body weight in insects every night. They eat a wide variety of insects depending on the species, and of course, multiple species of mosquitoes, which is good news for us. For foraging habitat, where bats go to feed, they often use open areas within forests, edge habitat, open water, and wetlands that are in the complex of the forest. Northern long-eared bats are generally forest interior species, and they can fly very well even through a very cluttered forest environment. And bats will generally move anywhere from a couple hundred meters to several kilometers each night from roost sites to appropriate foraging areas. So most of you are probably by now familiar with white nose syndrome, which has been devastating to bat populations across the country. White nose syndrome is the result of a fungus that invades and ingests the skin of hibernating bats, including their wings. It impacts the bodies of bats in a few different ways, but we know that it causes bats to wake up more frequently during the winter, and they use up their limited fat reserves very rapidly. Dead or dying bats are frequently observed with a white fuzz around their muzzles, and that is why the disease is called white nose syndrome. And as you remember, each time a bat wakes up during the winter, it really costs them as far as their fat reserves. So this is the primary way that white nose kills them, is to wake them up more often, causing them to basically not have the energy to live through the winter. So since the discovery of white nose syndrome in 2007 in New York, it has spread across the continent, and it is estimated to have killed at least 6.7 million bats. 35 states and 7 Canadian provinces have confirmed white nose syndrome in their bat populations. It was first discovered in Wisconsin in 2014 in a cave in Grant County, which is in southwestern Wisconsin. And since then, it has spread to all of our known hibernacula. This white nose syndrome epidemic is considered to be the worst wildlife disease outbreak in North American history. Some species, like northern long-eared bat and tricolored bat, are particularly hard hit. And the northern long-eared bat has disappeared from many areas in the Northeast where white nose was originally discovered. And that has led to the northern long-eared bat being listed as a threatened species by the Fish and Wildlife Service. And it's the reason why we're developing the Lake States Forest Management Bat HCP, which I'll talk about later. So just a little bit about how we gather information about bats. In order to gather information, we capture and track female bats in June and July. We don't always do this. We had a large project from 2014 to 2018 where we did this, and now we do it as funding is available. Captured bats are tagged with a radio transmitter, which we glue to them with temporary non-toxic surgical glue. It falls off after a while. Like I said, we can only track them for 1 to 2 weeks. And when we track them, we go out the day after tagging them and using telemetry, hone in on the specific tree they are using to confirm the tree and how many bats are using the tree. And then we return in the evening and watch as the bats emerge, and that's how we get a count of them. Unfortunately, this work is fairly hard, and especially since many of these species are becoming very uncommon, they're just becoming harder to catch, and so it's becoming harder and harder to do this work and gather this information. So what trees do bats use? In general, we found that they like to use large diameter hardwood trees for roosting, generally at least 31.2 centimeters DBH. You can see here that we found them in many different types of trees. They really liked like red oak and red maple, but we found them in all kinds of different trees, aspens. These are just their preferences. Here's a few pictures of the kind of areas where we find them roosting: cracks, under sloughing bark, and you can see it's very hard to see them. That's why the telemetry is key. It would be really hard to just go out and find a bat roosting in a tree like this. So I'm going to switch to talking now a little bit about some general guidance about beneficial forest management practices. And I just wanted to highlight these 2 documents. They're both developed by the White Nose Response group. It's a group of biologists, researchers, land managers from across North America. Both of these documents contain more detail about beneficial forest management for bats than I'm going to go into here, and they're both available on the whitenosesyndrome.org webpage, which I have there, and I can provide that link to Nikki too, so she could forward it on if anyone's interested in taking a look in more detail. Just want to highlight a few key habitat areas for bats. The hibernacula, obviously very important, maintaining the hibernacula in an undisturbed condition. The swarming and staging areas, these are the forested areas that are immediately around the hibernacula. Right now, with northern long-eared bat being listed as threatened, we're using the 4D rule to protect a 1/4 mile buffer of forest around the hibernacula and these swarming and staging areas. And then where you all would most likely interact with bats in forest management is their summer roosting habitat. And that is just forested areas out on the landscape where these bats are foraging and roosting during the summer. So just some general management practices. I'll start out by saying that really one of the most important actions that forest managers can take to maintain local populations of these bats is just to provide a continuous supply of suitable roost trees that will provide shelter for the bats and their pups. But as I mentioned earlier, the non-volant or flightless period for the pups is June and July. So if possible, avoiding disturbance during that season really helps the bats. Retaining all snags, except where safety is a concern, is a way of making sure there's plenty of roost trees. And when possible, leaving a group of live trees around the snags to prevent them from falling. And then just retaining some large trees that can become future snags, and as many trees as possible that have cavities, cracks, hollows, or sloughing bark. And I should also mention that these are all just these practices are all beneficial to a lot of different wildlife, and they're just suggestions of beneficial management for bats. There's nothing regulatory about any of these. These are just guidance. So if you're doing even age management, some beneficial practices that you can implement are retaining uncut patches that are variable in size throughout the harvest unit. Some of these areas can be really valuable foraging habitats. So retaining snags and some large live trees in the uncut patches gives them that sort of mosaic of foraging and roosting habitat all in one area. And if possible, locate some of the leaf tree patches near or adjacent to riparian areas or wetlands. These are really valuable foraging areas for bats. If you're doing some uneven age management, it's retaining snags and at least 30 square feet of basal area. If possible, keeping at least 16 live trees that are, a little bit larger, greater than 9 inches DBH per acre. And then same as the general guidance, just retaining as many of those trees that have cavities, cracks, and hollows as possible. Another really important thing that you can do on your forest land that can help bats and birds and all kinds of wildlife is managing invasive species. Non-native and invasive plants often outcompete native vegetation and reduce plant diversity and potentially dramatically alter forest habitat. Some invasive plants such as oriental bittersweet, honeysuckle, buckthorn, Japanese barberry can really choke out native trees. And some invasive tree species like Russian olive can really modify stand structure and can cause bats to use some of the riverine habitat that they rely on for foraging less. Non-native plants can also reduce insect biomass and disrupt the food web that the bats rely on. They heavily infested forests often have like a slightly less or less insect biomass than healthy native forests. And in addition, non-native species like burdock and some of those sort of shrubby things can pose a threat of entanglement to small flying vertebrates like birds and bats. So eradication and control of invasive species is very beneficial to bat habitat. In Wisconsin, we have forestry BMPs for invasive species that can help prevent the spread of invasive species. So if you want, you can take a look at those and try to implement them. And then if possible, use the most specific and least environmentally damaging pesticide products that you can to meet your management objectives. Just a few other considerations. I know that, health and safety always take precedent over habitat management. So sometimes snags and hazard trees need to be removed. Obviously, if they're posing an immediate risk, they should be removed right away. But if we can remove hazard trees during the winter when the bats aren't using them for roost, that's really beneficial. If you're using prescribed fire and managing your forest, and it's good to develop burn plans to minimize smoke impacts to hibernacula. That's the one thing that land management sometimes does impact hibernacula. If there's a prescribed fire nearby, that smoke can alter the interior environment. And the creation of management of forest openings within the forests. Small openings, less than 5 acres, can really provide really good foraging habitat and then good solar exposure to the roosting habitat. So those are just a few other considerations. And as I mentioned, much more detail is available in those 2 publications I highlighted from the White Nose Response team. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Lake States Forest Management Bat HCP right now. When Fish and Wildlife Service listed the northern long-eared bat as threatened back in 2016, they specifically identified forest management as a potential source of take for the species. This makes sense because during the summer, these species utilize trees for maternity colonies, day roosts, and foraging in and adjacent to forested areas, as we've talked about. Since these species are expected to become endangered in the future due to the impacts of white nose syndrome, and any take of endangered species is prohibited, the Lake States DNRs, that's Michigan, Minnesota, and Wisconsin, we're going to need an incidental take permit to continue forest management activities in the region. This is really important because sustainable forest management is a really important tool for conservation and habitat management in Wisconsin and the Lake States. We use forest management not only on our timber production lands, but it's really used extensively as a habitat management tool on our wildlife areas, parks, and on other lands where our primary objective is wildlife habitat or to preserve ecological values. Also, forest management is critically important economic sector in Wisconsin. The forestry industry in Wisconsin provides more than 63,000 jobs, many in rural areas of our state, and has a total industry output of 24.4 billion. Wisconsin has been the nation's #1 producer of paper products for over 50 years. So my point here is just that this project, the Lake States Forest Management Bat Habitat Conservation Plan, has a number of really important objectives. One is to conserve bat species, which provide many ecological services to humans and healthy ecosystems. And the other is to provide for the continuation of sustainable forest management in the Lake States, which is critically important to our management efforts and to the economy of many of our communities. Since forest management is a potential source of take for the listed bat species, northern long-eared bat and other bat species are likely to be listed as endangered in the future, and forest management is ecologically and economically important to forest lands in the Lake States. The 3 state DNRs, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Minnesota, are jointly developing the Lake States Forest Management Bat HCP, and the purpose of this project is to obtain federal incidental take authorization for the incidental take of bats during forest management and related activities. So the activities that'll be covered by a permit eventually will be forest management, prescribed fire, and the creation and maintenance of forestry roads. That is non-DOT roads, for roads that we build on our lands to support forest operations. We're collaborating. The collaboration between the states allows impacts to be analyzed at a landscape scale, and it will also provide, we have a lot of partners that work across state lines, so it should provide some regulatory consistency across state lines. The development of this process is being guided by a steering committee that consists of 2 representatives from each state, one from the Forestry Division and one from the Endangered Resources Program. That's myself in Wisconsin and Kristen Lambert for the Forestry Division in Wisconsin. And if you're in Minnesota, Lacey Levine and Bridget Henning-Randa are the representatives on the steering committee. We also have representatives from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and a contractor that has been hired to write the HCP and complete all the necessary analyses. This process began in 2015 and hopefully will be wrapping up sometime toward the end of this year. When we get the permit in Wisconsin and Minnesota, the species that'll be covered will be the northern long-eared bat, the tricolored bat, and the little brown bat. If you work in Michigan at all, they're also covering the Indiana bat under their permit. We do not have Indiana bat in Wisconsin and Minnesota. I should also mention that we will have a way of allowing our external partners to join our permit. So private landowners, counties in Wisconsin and in the other states that meet certain criteria will be able to join our incidental take permit and receive take authorization under our permit. All right, that's all I have for you. I guess we're going to do questions at the end. I'll just say thank you for listening. And even if you have a question later after this ends and you'd like to contact me, there's my contact information. So thanks again for listening.
Great. Thank you, Sarah, for that information. Before we get to our next presenter, I want to remind everyone that if you do have questions, please type them in the chat box. I see that we have one question already, but feel free to continuously type them throughout the webinar. The Q&A session will be at the end. Our next presenter today is Rich Courtemanche, who has been with the Aitkin County Land Department since 2011 and the Land Commissioner since 2018. In 1997, Aitkin County was one of the first county-managed forest lands in the U.S. to become third-party certified during ensuring that management meets the highest ecological and social standards. Aitkin County's management includes commitment to the state's wildlife action plans and addressing conservation needs of species such as forest bats. Rich will talk about developing best management practices for forest bats in Minnesota and a county perspective. And Rich, you can go ahead and start sharing your screen.
Okay, thank you very much. Sarah did a fantastic job, and I will say everything that she said in Wisconsin relates to Minnesota also. And so I really, thinking about what I wanted to present, thought maybe I go in a different direction and kind of give you a story. Let's see, are you seeing my presentation now?
Yes, I am.
All right. And at first I was approached to give this talk, and there are a lot of people who really deserve a lot more credit than me to give this talk. You know, my former land commissioner, my predecessor, Mark Jacobs, was known kind of locally as Batman. And there are a lot of other partners that came to the table, Carleton County Land Commissioner Greg Bernew, the scientists at West Inc., the staff of my county, as well as my Environmental Learning Center at Long Lake Conservation Center, Dovetail Partners, especially Katie Fernholz, our contemporaries at the Forest Stewards Guild, who took an early interest in this, especially a old friend of mine, Peter Bundy, who has passed. But just to say that this is a team effort. Aitkin County has nearly 250,000 acres of land that we manage, mostly tax forfeit. And Aitkin is in north central Minnesota. And if you take a look at Aitkin County, and this picture shows the county, and anything that's in color, including the blue, is public land. We have a fantastic mixture of state, county, and federal lands, and nearly half of all the land in Aitkin County is publicly managed. And that's important because there is not a lot of people, less than 16,000 people in the whole county, and limited infrastructure, limited industry, and forestry is an essential part of our economy. It is the #1 private industry in Aitkin County. Other things like government and schools and hospitals and stuff may be bigger, but forestry, as Sarah mentioned, is a really important part of rural Minnesota and Wisconsin. And so Aitkin County manages land mostly through timber harvesting, but through a lot of things for the public benefit. And it's really important to stress that we really strive to improve the quality of life for the people in the county and providing benefits. You know, we think of forestry, but in reality, clean water goes down the Mississippi River to the Twin Cities, and 3.5 million people get clean water from our working forest. Recreation, all this land is open for hunting and recreation. And carbon storage, this meant working forest has already been determined that it is a fantastic opportunity to help curb global warming and provide a better quality of life and wildlife and species of concern such as bats. So back in 2013, there was the white nose syndrome. It was discussed, and having long memories, we remember the days of the spotted owl, and we're like, well, we need to learn from our past mistakes. Can we do better? Are there bats, even bats in the Aitkin County? I mean, there's no known hibernacular anywhere near. We have no caves, and there's been no sightings Obviously, my foresters had a sum total of over 150 years of working experience and never seen a bat, but we kind of work different work shifts. So we were really concerned about forest bats back in 2013 and wanted to know, here's this candidate, this northern long-eared bat. It's a threatened candidate for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And what about little brown bat? And, you know, if the bats are here, what kind of forest management, how does that affect bat populations? These were questions we had no answers for. The Fish and Wildlife Service were proposing restrictions on forest harvesting from April to October. They were talking about plantations and hardwoods and softwoods. And so we had the opportunity to find a partner in West Inc. Who were doing bat surveys in the area, and ask them some questions, ask them to do some research for us to help us answer these questions. You know, can we get a habitat assessment? What do you think our woods are like? And we do different kinds of surveys to make sure what species of bat we have? And so we follow the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service guidelines and did the studies. And we did it in multiple areas of forestry. Here is a regeneration from a clear cut. We do a lot, and Aitkin County is dominated by hardwoods, and so we do a lot of hardwood management. Here's a variable density thinning and a patch cut in one of our forest stands, as well as thinnings. And so we really took the opportunity to take the science and really get out and evaluate where we have bats, what kind of bats do we have, and see if our forest management had any impact. This is an acoustic survey box listening for bats. And bats we found. There's a little, I will pass on letting you listen to the clicks, but we were really excited about finding bats, lots of bats. Some nights over 20 bats were captured in, using harp nets. And then we did some telemetry, and there's that little antenna put on with a non-toxic surgical glue that Sarah was mentioned. And we tracked them. We tracked them, and to the right side, you see that snag tree, and you think, oh, great bat habitat. But in reality, most of the times when we found bats, we found them in not dead or diseased trees, but more in trees that were declining. So the tree on the left actually was a roost tree. And we found 5 of the 7 species that occur in Minnesota. So the goal of the project was a success in our mind. What is the composition of the bat species in our forest? And it was great, 5 to 7 species, large numbers. Originally, back in 2013, it was thought maybe there'd be about 5,000 northern long-eared bats in the state of Minnesota. And the new estimates with the numbers that were found and through these studies, we were thinking that would be just in Aitkin County alone. Are the northern long-eared bats residents? Yes. 28% of the bats netted were northern long-eared bats. And the news that we took to heart was that there were no differences based on our forest activity. The numbers were pretty constant in every type of forest. And then 2014, as Sarah mentioned, the northern long-eared bat was listed as threatened. And the 4D rule, which is the federal government's rules on management and how we can protect and be the solution for these species, was enacted. And Aitkin County has been FSC certified, third-party certified, since 1997. And it's one of our goals is to be the recovery for endangered species. And so we were asking the new questions in these 2 years, and we started to continue monitoring. First, we developed stand level best management practices. We greater than 5% residual retention. That is important. That's in Minnesota Best Management Guidelines. However, Aitkin County historically had been higher, 9 to 11%. And we recognized through a lot of different studies that we had that reserve patches were way more beneficial than leaving isolated trees. There's something about a patch of trees that help control temperature, have species diversity, that will be allowed to progress through their old age and final decline, that provide additional anchors and snag trees and habitat into the future. And as Sarah mentioned, riparian management areas are extremely important. And we also wanted to, since we were doing the telemetry, we started finding known roost trees. And so we developed stand level guidelines to making sure that these roost trees were protected. We also developed a series of management tools to provide our foresters, such as creating forest best management practices. This is the trifle that our foresters keep in the vehicle. And it talked about the different kinds of forestry, regeneration harvests, in making sure that we keep no buffers around known roost trees and reserving large patches. If there's no known roost trees, maintaining those buffers around riparian wetland areas, snag trees, mash trees, as well as cull. In our intermediate harvest, something which it was our thinnings and our patch cuts, very similar. But we went to the extra to mark the trees so that we could find them in future reference. When we came back into the future, we would be able to ensure that we protect those. So we've been running with those best management practices pretty successfully. We are continuing our studies, and we've known that white nose syndrome is now in the area because our bat populations are declining. And we recognize the fact that it's a disease issue, not a forest management issue. We found forest bats in areas of hardwoods, in softwoods, roost trees as little as 3 inches. Though they do prefer the larger 9 to 20-inch trees that are showing decline versus decay or cracked. But our forest management wasn't enough of a solution. So we, Carleton County and Aitkin County, decided to come into a partnership, being that our management is hardwoods, that we had good data, and that we were continuing with that data. We hired West Inc. to create our own habitat conservation plan. It's a smaller plan than the tri-state, but it represents the counties. As Sarah mentioned, the DNRs of those 3 states are the ones creating the habitat conservation plan. And despite the millions of acres of county land being managed, we didn't find ourselves at the table. And we were concerned. We have to be concerned because, like I said, what would happen if the most important industry in your community disappeared? And what happens if the land no longer could provide income to be kept public land? These are good questions. Aitkin County's income every year goes to our counties, our school districts, and our townships. The $1.8 million that Aitkin County generates gets dispersed every year to these important groups. So it became important to us that we made sure that we protected our most important private industry. And we did this because we had the data. We had a plan based on hardwoods, which is our dominant cover type. It's implementable, it's understandable. And what we're doing is to codify the 4D rule that we had shown on those other stand management, best management guidelines, and to make sure that they're held in perpetuity. We're also reserve patches and distances from roost trees and finding roost trees. These are all measurable, and it's very defendable to show that we are meeting our objectives. And it's responsive, meaning we as two counties can make decisions and make changes working with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service directly. And being that we had the data and had our contractor, we felt it was going to be quick. We could do this before the species became endangered, was put on the endangered list. And so that when it was enacted, we didn't have to wait to have a HCP in place. Well, it wasn't quick. So what should have been done in 2018, we're still working on. And the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has been through our HCP. We are working out the last details of the memorandum of understanding between Carleton County and Aitkin County. And we're hoping that we will be able to continue protecting forest bats with those same best management practices that Sarah was mentioning, using our HCP, and keep our industry and our communities and our public well engaged for managing our lands. So that's what I have, and I'll take questions.
Great, thank you, Rich. I will share my screen real quick. And at this time, if anybody, wants to unmute and ask your question out loud, feel free to do so as well. Let me get my screen all situated. Okay, so we have 2 questions so far. The first one being, it's kind of a comment and a question. I had a little brown bat on April 15th. Does this mean they are hibernating nearby? He took 3 to the wildlife center. They were dehydrated and thin. 2 of them had respiratory infections and were euthanized, and the 3rd was put into hibernation and will be released. There was no white nose reported. So I think this was for Sarah.
Yeah, so it probably means that they were hibernating somewhere nearby. Little brown bats will, they'll hibernate in caves and mines, but they'll also, hibernate in your attic if they can, or in a barn, if it's protected enough. So yeah, they probably were hibernating somewhere nearby.
Great. A second question is thoughts about bat houses mounted in the yard. We have 2 from previous owners. Do we need to clean them out routinely?
So bat houses should be pretty low maintenance. It's a good idea to, I don't know, once every year, a couple of years, to make sure that the seams are still solid, so they're pretty weatherproof. And if they get any, sometimes they get wasps or hornets and stuff, to clean that stuff out. The critical part is you might want to just make sure that you're cleaning them out in the winter. You don't want to do it during the time when they might be using the box. So yeah, it's okay to clean them out and to do some maintenance on them once in a while, but you don't have to clean them out like super often or anything.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah.
If anybody wants to, turn on their mic and ask a question out loud, please feel free to do so. Or you can, type them into the chat. I had a quick question. Is there anything you can do to treat white nose syndrome, or is it essentially a death sentence if the bat gets it?
So there are many things that people are looking at to treat white nose syndrome: delivery of vaccines, sanitation or sanitizing hibernacula using UV light or using antifungal substances. The problem you always have with wildlife health is getting those things out there. So vaccinating bats, they're not going to come to your vaccine clinic. So you've got to find a way to do that. And we have participated in some research where we capture a couple bats and put vaccine or treatment on them, and then they go in, and since they get all together in the hibernacula and in the bat houses, we measure how well those things get passed on to other bats. And so there's a lot of research going on, but right now we don't have a good cost-effective treatment. So like UV light and stuff like that, that will work. But then the next time a bat that's infected with the fungus comes into the hibernacula, it's reinfested, and so it would have to be cleaned again. So there's a lot of research going on out there, but nothing that's in widespread use right now.
And also towards your question, is it a death sentence? Not always. I mean, granted, white nose syndrome is killing the vast majority of the bats, but a bat can get white nose syndrome and make it through. It's basically on the timing. In fact, one of the things when we do our surveys, we're looking at scarring on bats. Did they have the disease and have made it through? But white nose is the problem. It's not necessarily the forest management. It's this disease, and until we find a solution, the bats are in trouble.
Yeah, I would just echo that and say that in the eastern United States, where they've had white nose syndrome a lot longer than we have in Wisconsin and Minnesota, the bats have not necessarily gone extinct out there. They've been reduced greatly to about 10% of their pre-white nose populations, and they're holding on at that right now. So are some of the bats immune? Maybe those are the ones that just don't get as close to the other bats in the hibernacula. But yeah, and we also know that like big brown bats, they get white nose syndrome, but they're not dying at as high of rates as the other species. Maybe it's because they're bigger, they have more reserves. So yeah, it's not necessarily a death sentence, but it is the reason why bats are in serious decline.
Thank you. Does anybody want to unmute? I'll give you guys a few minutes if you would like to unmute and ask your question out loud.
Excellent job, Sarah. You covered my normal talk on bats, and I appreciate the opportunity, folks, for this today. This was a really nice webinar.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for listening.
Hi, this is Bill. Bill Schuster. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
So it's more of a comment than maybe a question, but I just want to say I really appreciate the work in both of these presentations. I was working for the Minnesota DNR when the whole deal came out about the long-eared bat and the white nose syndrome, and of course the knee-jerk reaction was, oh no, we can't log. We're going to have to change. And I really like all the work that Aitkin County did in the research and to say, hey, no, here we'll just follow some guidelines and continue logging and not end up like those with the spotted owl issue. So just want to say thanks. And then, the tangible output for me, or the takeaway, is continue doing what I'm doing as I manage forest and not feel bad, but continue doing things that will help the bats. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, Bill. We have one question in the chat box. What is going to make the largest difference as far as protecting bat species, employing BMPs or finding a new way to address white nose syndrome?
Curing white nose syndrome.
Yes, if we found a treatment or a cure for white nose syndrome, that would make the biggest difference.
Yeah.
Forest management has always been compatible with bat populations. In fact, before we had white nose syndrome in Wisconsin, our population of bat was actually increasing. Like our yearly hibernacula surveillance was showing increasing populations. So the things that we've highlighted today, Rich and I, are things that in a lot of ways we're already doing in our forests. We're certified, we're doing sustainable forest management. And we just want to keep doing those things so that when the bats, if they can recover, if they start to recover, we'll still have all that great habitat on the landscape that we've always had.
The term my predecessor always used is the mosaic on the landscape. I mean, the deep, dark forests are good places for a bat to roost and be cool, but you need to have open areas for hunting, for finding bugs And where are those? They're usually in the open areas. And so, yes, that mosaic.
Mhm.
I'm wondering if y'all are aware of the nose sensor technology, the research that's been going on in Mississippi to detect white nose syndrome. I'm retired Forest Service. We had a scientist who is working with a nose sensor. He did it for wood decay in hardwood trees, but he's adapted it to where you can take a sensor in front of a cave, and he's working with the molecules that will detect white nose syndrome in a cave in parts per billion, so that you can just hold this sensor in front of the cave and it'll tell you whether the bats in there have white nose or not. Have y'all heard of that kind of research?
I am not familiar with it. And all of our hibernacula in Wisconsin are infected with white nose, but that could, if that can be developed, that could be very useful for especially places out west where they're just at the frontier of white nose infection.
He's testing it on caves in Arkansas right now.
May I take a stab at Deborah's question?
Yes, let me just read it out loud for people if they can't see the
Sure.
chat box. What as landowners can we do to help or protect bats?
And I would say create habitat. And it's that mosaic of habitat. Make on your landscape, working forests provide the hunting, the roosting, and the life cycle habitat for bats. Keeping in mind that bats roost typically in declining or stressed out trees. So those important wildlife trees that may have been taken out as diseased or bad before have their place on the habitat, on the landscape, and they should be protected. And in my mind, if you're going to do harvesting, try to keep your reserve patches in aggregates, and let them go through their full cycle, even to the point of falling down and declining, and allowing them to go through that old growth and to eventually falling down and allowing the next generation to come up. Because those are the things on the landscape that I think are so important for our habitats, for our wildlife habitats, when we're doing our forest management.
Great, thank you. Another question just came in. It's about bat houses as well. What about bat houses in wooded areas? Are they helpful or not in the bigger picture?
So one important thing about bat houses is to make sure that they have they're exposed to the sun a little bit each day. You don't want them too much, but they need some solar exposure so that they're warm enough. I mean, they're not, I think putting up bat houses is great. I don't, in the grand scheme of things, it's great. You know, roosts, like I said, roosts can be more limiting than food. So I don't think it would be worth it for us as an agency to invest a lot of time in putting bat houses out in the state forest and stuff. But for an individual on your land, yeah, I think it could be helpful to have some bat houses out there.
And it is known that maternity roosts are the bats come back to these general areas often throughout their life cycle. The bat life cycle, they're long-lived species. And one of the things that were coming out from our studies with the telemetry studies is that bats will change roost trees every 3 to 5 days and move their young, even if the young are not able to fly. So they are actually moving their young. So having bat houses, if they use them, great, but the bats may not stay there throughout the whole rearing season.
Great, thank you. One more minute, so if anybody wants to sneak in a question real quick, feel free to do so. Okay, doesn't seem like anybody has any more questions. So Sarah and Rich, thank you so much for taking time to speak with us today. I know in the comments, there's a lot of thank yous as well. So I learned a lot today. Yeah, so that concludes our webinar for today, and hopefully you guys have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye.